In Africa, the shortest route to ill-gotten wealth is political leadership. If you want to get wealth without working for it at all, join African politics. That is the truth everywhere in Africa except for very few places. The rest in Africa, I do not know. Excuse me, I'm a visitor. But when I was a student, I was told that in our tradition we had this thing called hunters and gatherers. That instinct is still alive and well in our political leaders. They hunt and gather buildings and cars and money. And that is why African leadership does not attract her best men and women. And African electorate also responds to money. I do not know whether it happens here in Africa, in Ghana. The African electorate also expects to be bribed so that they can vote. And until the day we are able to exercise the ghost of ethnicity, among other things, and the ghost of corruption in Africa, Africa will never get good leaders. Who among you here will forget the exploits of Congo's Mobutu Sese Seko, who at one time was richer than his country, courtesy of his kleptocratic regime? Who among you here will forget the madness of Jean Bedel Bokassa, who crowned himself an emperor? Who among you here can afford the luxury of forgetting such individuals? Who among you will forget the activities of Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia? Who among you can afford that luxury? Who among you here can afford to forget the activities of Hissène Habré in Chad? And the list is as long as your arm. African leaders were engaged in the kind of politics that was destructive of the continent. And African peoples were no longer enjoying their independence. Nkrumah had been clear in his mind that we seek first the political kingdom and the rest will be given unto us. But it would appear that the African leaders had it differently. Seek ye first the political kingdom and poison the political kingdom they must have had. So they poisoned the political kingdom and denied the African population the opportunity of enjoying the economic dividends of independence. They denied the Africans the opportunity of enjoying the dividends of unity. And Africa became not only the land of coups, but also the land of guerrilla fighters. Because these guerrilla fighters now emerged from the bush because Africa had to be liberated one way or the other. We had many of them. In Ethiopia, we had a guerrilla movement that brought up Meles Zenawi. And to his credit, there was some semblance of normalcy and sobriety returned to Ethiopia. In Rwanda, after the genocide in 1994, we had Paul Kagame, and to his credit, there was some semblance of normalcy and sobriety returned to that country. There was the emergence of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni in Uganda, and to his credit, he restored some sobriety and normalcy to that country. We had another one in Liberia, but to his lack of credit, he destroyed that country, Charles Taylor. So that what happened is that African politics was confused. And I want to submit to you that African politics was not only confused, but it had been captured by individuals who had no interest in the safety and long-term health of the continent. So there was a time, because there was never ever a shortage of African leaders who meant well. They meant well, but there was always the hand of the erstwhile colonizer whose agenda was to demonstrate that Africans could not lead themselves. But even in those dark moments, there were great African leaders whose clarity of mind and clarity of vision was always the saving grace. It is not that they did not make mistakes. They made many mistakes, but they were honest mistakes. Who can forget Tanzania's Julius Kambarage Nyerere at that time? Who can forget at that time Zambia's Kenneth David Kaunda? Who can forget them? Who can forget at that time Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal? Who can forget at that time Côte d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny? Who can forget that there were leaders who may have been making mistakes, including the introduction of one-party states as a possible antidote to the African problem, but they meant well. But the body of Africa was cancerous. And no amount of political chemotherapy was going to cure this cancer. The cancer had spread too deep. And that is why, therefore, today, I have said that there is need for the reawakening of African politics. Because what is happening in Africa today, perhaps if we took a mental survey of Africa, you will be able to agree with me that this particular argument is both timely and legitimate. Afford me a little luxury, if only to run across Africa, to identify for ourselves what is wrong with Africa today, and why our politics need to enjoy some newly introduced political hygiene. Look at Africa today. Look at Gabon. They have just been through an election, and they do not agree as to who has won and who has lost. In Africa, everybody wins the election. Look at Gabon. I want you to look at Zambia. They do not know who has lost and who has won. In Africa, nobody loses an election. The Zambians are not at ease. And you can go to many countries. You can go to Uganda in the recent past, Kenya in the recent past. We as Africans have a problem. You know, I was telling a friend of mine that Africa has a problem with counting votes. In other parts of the world, they can have voters in 50 million, in hundreds of millions, but in Africa, our voters never get past 10 million, but for some reason, when we are called upon to count our votes, we never can count the votes. This is an African disease, the inability to count votes. And in my view and in my submission, that inability and that inadequacy of Africa to count the votes is one of the problems why Africa must reorient and must reawaken in our politics. So when you look at Africa today, and sometimes we don't talk about it as openly and as passionately and as painfully as we should speak about it, because we do not know and appreciate that Africa remains, in the words of a Westerner who said that Africa remains a scar on the conscience of humanity. We may think that that is not politically correct, but it is the truth as I speak to you. Today, if we continue with our survey of Africa, We'll have occasion during the other lectures to talk about the economy and unity, but let us focus on the politics of it. Look at Mozambique today. Attained our independence from the Portuguese as I speak to you now. It is not to be found in the headlines of many African newspapers, but there is a contestation in Mozambique between Frelimo and Renamo. The country is not at ease, yet they held an election. As I speak to you today, the Zambians are not at ease. They may have sworn their president on Tuesday of last week, but the opposition are now taking the matter, as they say, to the United Nations. We are exporting our problems. Africa cannot solve our problems. If you look at Angola, they are in a state that the Portuguese describe as "non guerra, non paz," no war and no peace. It is deceptive calm. You look at Equatorial Guinea, their politics is the kind of politics that does not allow people to express themselves. And as if Equatorial Guinea was not enough, you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, the richest resource country in the world, yet one of the poorest countries in the world. They cannot hold an election. They say they have no money. You go to Burundi, it is the same thing. You go to Eritrea, Eritrea is not at ease. You go to Somalia, it is not at ease. You go to Central African Republic, you go to Burkina Faso, they expelled their president a few months ago. You go to Niger, go to Mali, they are killing one another as recently as yesterday. Go to Mauritania, go to Sierra Leone, they are not at ease. Go to the Gambia. There is a sense in which Africa needs to conduct her affairs differently. Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia is right. Africa is not poor. Africa is merely poorly managed. And that is why we must ask ourselves, what is wrong with us? Writing in 1983, the famed Ghanaian writer Chinua Achebe writes of his own country, and he could well have been writing about Africa. He said, the trouble with Africa is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. And I dare add, there is also a problem of followership. Africans elect the leaders that they deserve. A South African writer called Greg Mills, in a book called Why Africa is Poor and What They Can Do About It, says that what amazes him, that despite the talk of democratization in Africa, it would appear that Africans are in the habit of making wrong choices 10 out of 10 times. When they are given the vote to vote, they are in the habit of electing thieves. And once they have elected the thieves, they expect the thieves to behave like angels. He says he does not understand the African electorate. I too do not understand the African electorate. And that is why, therefore, going forward, we Africans must ask ourselves a very critical question in the political arena. Because if we don't get it right in politics, we will not get right in economics. History has demonstrated times without number that until and unless you get your politics right, you will never get it right in your economics. I want to submit to us that if Africa is to liberate herself from the kind of politics that has held Africa down, Africa must go back to the words of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. You know, when you look at Africa, it was almost 50 years ago. In fact, more than 50 years ago, 53 years to be exact, in 1963 when the OAU was founded. We thought that the OAU was the problem, and we started moving in the direction that had been prescribed to us by Kwame Nkrumah. So that in the year 2002, we created another body called the African Union. The African Union was designed to be a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more thoroughgoing than the OAU. Several years after the African Union, Africa is no better. Occasionally, our former colonizers want to make us feel good, and they tell us things that we want to hear, so that every other year we have things that are called indices of democracy. And in these indices of democracy, they are hard to say that Africa is now democratizing, that African countries now hold elections frequently. Says Kenya held an election, Uganda held an election, Tanzania held an election, Ghana since 1979 has been holding an election. Every country has been holding election. Elections are the new thing in town. And we are therefore satisfied that frequent periodic elections are the solution to African problems. Every other year, Africans are confronted with candidates, and these candidates have also mastered the art. Periodically, they present to you their agenda of governance, and they remind you of little things that they may have done. That happens in Ghana, it happens everywhere in Africa, but the African condition remains the way it was 53 years ago. In real terms, those of you who are here may be a little better than your cousins in rural Africa, but in real terms, you are no better. In real terms, there is a sense in which your cousins in rural Africa don't have to grapple with rents that are paid 2 years in advance in Accra, in Cape Coast. They don't have to grapple with importing tea and other things from the United Kingdom. They don't have to ally themselves with the political class in order to realize their dreams. There is a sense in which they are immunized from that. Yet there is a sense in which we cannot run away from politics and its impact on the quality of our lives. And that is why we must ask ourselves going forward, what it is or what is it that we must do in order to be politically awake? And that brings me to what I consider to be the major African problem, and is something that we are very uncomfortable about. You know, in our unguarded moments, we Africans, in our unguarded moments, we behave as if we are inferior to the white person. In our unguarded moments. In fact, even in our guarded moments, we sometimes do so. And that is why when we have problems which can be solved within the African continent, we are much more ready to seek assistance elsewhere. You know, I do not know where Ghana is going to print her ballots for the next election, but I suspect they'll be printed in the United Kingdom. Ghana is no different from other countries. Africans have lost faith in themselves. They cannot trust themselves. They will never print ballots in Ghana because we, for some reason, believe that we are thieves and that if we print them, we'll steal them. In Zambia recently, they printed their ballots. In Dubai. In Kenya, we printed our ballots. In the United Kingdom, All the former French colonies will have them printed in Paris. Then you wonder why our politics is controlled by external factors. When African politicians have been engaged in an election, the very first congratulatory word that they expect, if they were colonized by the British, they are waiting very eagerly whether the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom will ring them. And once they receive that call, then they will know that we have been approved and we are now good to go. There is need for reawakening in the manner in which we do things. In fact, there is a sense in which if we do not go back to what Kwame said in 1963, the tragedy is that Kwame Nkrumah could see this in 1963. He could see it. And that is why he was saying, let us unite now. Because it is only in unity. I remember in 1963, when he's talking about political unity, he's saying, I am urging all of you who are present here today, let us come out of this hall with a united Africa, with one army, with a one command unit, with one common currency, because it is only then that we are going to immunize ourselves from the shenanigans of our colonizers. Of course, you ended up with your little sovereignties, and today your politics are the subject of manipulation by European powers. If you had accepted Kwame Nkrumah's view, he was clear at that time that you would have one passport. Today, I moved 3 hours to Togo. I have a Togolese passport printed in France, written in French, asking you about immigration and yellow fever certificate. Nkrumah could see this, and all this is courtesy of bad politics. You go between Senegal and Gambia, they are quarreling about the borders and the boundaries. And when you cross the nation, there are the same ethnic groups across the border. Africa must, in the nature of things, ask herself, what must we do with our politics? This is the mother question. And why is this question important? It is important because I can tell you, without being a Jewish prophet nor being related to one, that if we do not do anything about our politics, Africa will go nowhere. Today, there are two types of people who look at Africa. They are the Afro-pessimists and Afro-optimists. The Afro-pessimists take the view that Africa is God-forsaken, that Africa will go nowhere, that Africans will perpetually be hewers of wood and drawers of water for other civilizations, that Africa will only be humored by other civilizations. Those are the Afro-pessimists. Then there are those who take the view that Africa is now on the rise, that Africa can realize our potential, that Africa, with our 1.1 billion people, is capable in the next 50 years of competing with other civilizations. I am myself an Afro-optimist of the guarded kind. I believe that this continent has the capacity to shock the world. I have the conviction that this continent has the capacity to change Africa and to change the world. Has it ever been lost on you that Africa has always been on the rise? Through different historical epochs, Africa has always been on the rise. In the 15th century, when the Portuguese were building the Elmina Castle, Africa was on the rise. But it was on the rise for the Portuguese. Then it rose for the Dutch at the same castle. Then it rose for the English. Then it appeared to rise for the Ghanaians in 1957. It appeared to rise. Then something held her down, and Ghana could never quite soar. And there was an apparent darkness at noon, but I now know it was never a sunset. I knew it was an eclipse. And because it is an eclipse and there's only the clouds that have kind of shielded it, I know the African sun will rise in her splendor. But it will only rise if we begin to do things differently. Those of you who are present here, some of you may be in positions of leadership. Some of you may be aspiring to positions of leadership in the political arena. But the question is, why do you want to lead? One of the things that we must do is to change our political culture. And political culture requires, among other things, that we must know that in the modern democratic dispensation, leadership is about governance and about servant leadership. Africa must recognize that if Africa is to survive. The African electorate must also be educated. But one of the things that worries me, it appears that formal education, this education where we get degrees, does not appear to help. We need another kind of education. We need a kind of education that changes our minds and hearts. A kind of education that revolutionizes our minds and hearts. It is only that other kind of education that is going to change us. And that kind of education is the kind of education that I think Kwame Nkrumah was talking about. If you listen to Kwame Nkrumah quite clearly, if you listen to him quite clearly, you Ghanaians and fellow Africans, and I have carefully read Kwame Nkrumah and his numerous speeches, it is amazing that as early as 1960s, he had the wisdom to see that science and technology was at the very heart of human development. And he founded the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. Today, I'm told that half of the graduates there graduate in humanities. You lost the script, so that the university is in danger of becoming a university of science and technology simply because it is its name. And I'm submitting to you, my fellow Africans, that until the day we have a political reawakening, Africa will never occupy her rightful place. Today, we have 54 African countries. Today, we have 54 passports. Today, we have slightly under 45 currencies, because CFA franc has reduced the number. All these currencies are soft currencies. The term soft is never used. The only hard currencies that we have are the dollar, the pound sterling, the euro. The yen sometimes is soft, sometimes it is hard, but it's hardening anyway. The yuan is beginning to harden. Not a single African country has any currency that is worth talking about. You leave Ghana with your cedi and pesawa, you go to Senegal, is as good as pepper. I came with my shilling here, it is useless, it can buy me nothing. I go to Angola and I have my kwanza, it is useless. The trick lies in political reawakening so that we are able to see things differently. This is why China, you may quarrel about her politics, but China knows what she wants in her politics. That is why China is capable of assembling Africans, heads of states in Beijing, and they all rush there. The 54 of them, all of them will go there. China does that. If today the President of the United States of America wanted to assemble African leaders, he only had to do this, and they will all rush to Washington. Last month, the Chinese Prime Minister assembled 35 African heads of states in Nairobi, Kenya, and they all went there. Because we are political lightweights. We have no presence in the Security Council of the United Nations. We have no presence. When there is a meeting of the G8, occasionally they invite 1 or 2 African leaders just as a way of humoring them. And they are kept mostly in some waiting room. When the real issues are being discussed, they'll never be there. Then they are invited when there is a photo opportunity. And if you look very keenly, they'll stand at the back. The real leaders stand in front. When there is the G20, the same thing is done. In other words, until the day that we are able to demonstrate that we have become politically of age, nobody is going to respect us. And that is why this afternoon, this evening, I've started my series of lectures where I think I ought to have started by talking about what Kwame said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and the rest shall be given unto you." Kwame was so clear in saying so. Kwame was so clear in saying that we should neither look east nor west, we should look forward. And he was clear that until the day that we are united, we are not going to achieve anything. And speaking in 1964 in Cairo, he said, "Africa is such a geographically unified continent. If only she could find political unity and political clarity, this continent will be a great continent. Her people will be a people that are respected. Her people will be a people that will realize their potential. Her politics will be the politics that will help Africa and help Africans and make Africa to be a continent and a people that are respected in the world." Kwame Nkrumah was right. Kwame Nkrumah is right. Kwame Nkrumah will always be right. But do we have the spirit of Kwame Nkrumah? This is what we must imbue ourselves with. We must honor Kwame Nkrumah by doing the things that he talked about, because he must have been born 50 years ahead of his time. But now, 50 years later, we should be able to see what Kwame stood for. Let us wake up that we may realize our potential. Thank you, and may God bless.